What happens when a moment of racist humiliation at 30,000 feet collides with the terrifying power of a billionaire's love? You're about to find out. This isn't just a story about revenge. It's about the aftershock. When Dr. Evelyn Reed had a cup of Coke thrown on her during a first-class flight, her husband, Fiona Blackett, didn't just get an apology. He bought the airline and fired everyone involved. The world cheered, but they didn't see what came next. They didn't see how one act of absolute justice could ignite a firestorm that threatened to burn their entire world down. The air in first class on a transatlantic flight has a specific quality, a sterile hum punctuated by the gentle clinking of real glassware and the hushed deferential whispers of the cabin crew. For Dr. Evelyn Reed it was a familiar, if slightly impersonal, sanctuary. At 42, she was a woman who commanded respect not through volume, but through a quiet, unshakable confidence. As a leading pediatric oncologist at Johns Hopkins, her days were a maelstrom of calculated risks, heartbreaking losses and triumphant hard-won victories. The sterile calm of the cabin was a welcome respite. She was flying from London back to New York, returning from a conference where she had presented her latest research on gene-targeted therapies. Her husband, Fiona, had wanted to send the jet, but she'd insisted on a commercial flight. She enjoyed the anonymity, the brief hours of being just another face in the crowd, untethered from the gravity of her work and the larger-than-life persona of her husband. Fiona Blackett was a name that echoed in the boardrooms of Wall Street and the marbled halls of power in Washington. His firm, Blackett Holdings, was a leviathan of private equity, a silent hand that shaped industries. To the public, he was an enigma, a rarely photographed titan of finance. To Evelyn, he was just Fiona, the man who still made her tea in the morning, who could listen for hours as she dissected a complex case, and whose fierce, almost primal devotion to her was the anchor of her life. She settled into her seat, 1A. A spacious pod of cream leather and polished burr wood. She'd already changed into a comfortable cashmere lounge set, her hair pulled back in an elegant twist. Across the aisle in 1D and 1F were the sources of a low, grating thrum of energy that was beginning to disturb the cabin's manufactured peace. They were young men, perhaps in their early 20s, draped in the casual armor of generational wealth designer hoodies, limited edition sneakers, and watches that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. They called each other Bryce and Chad. Their laughter was loud and brash, a territorial marking of the space. They were already on their third round of whiskies, and the flight had barely reached cruising altitude. Evelyn put on her noise-cancelling headphones and tried to focus on a medical journal, but their presence was intrusive. They weren't just loud, they were performatively obnoxious, making snide remarks about the other passengers just loud enough to be heard. They critiqued a woman's handbag, mocked a man's balding head, and spoke to the flight attendants with a dismissive arrogance that made Evelyn's jaw tighten. The lead flight attendant, a woman in her late 50s named Brenda, with a helmet of perfectly coiffed blonde hair and a name tag that read Lead Service Manager, seemed to handle them with a practiced if weary indulgence. Their boorishness was the price of a first-class ticket, her smile seemed to say. An hour into the flight, Evelyn took off her headphones to ask for some water. As she did, she caught a snippet of their conversation. "Can't believe they let just anyone in first class these days," Chad said, his voice carrying easily. He wasn't looking at Evelyn, but his gaze flickered towards her for a fraction of a second. Bryce snorted. "Affirmative action, bro, all the way to the front of the plane." The comment hung in the air, thick and ugly. It was meant for her. There was no one else it could be for. Evelyn was the only black person in the first-class cabin. She felt a familiar hot prickle of anger, an emotion she had learned to masterfully conceal beneath a veneer of cool indifference. She had faced this her entire life, the subtle digs, the backhanded compliments, the presumed incompetence. She was Dr. Reed, a woman who saved children's lives, but in that moment to them, she was just a color, a quota, an object of their juvenile contempt. She met Bryce's gaze directly. Her stare was not angry, not hurt, but cold and analytical, the same look she gave a tumor on an MRI scan. It was a look that said, "I see you for exactly what you are, small, insignificant, and malignant." Bryce faltered for a second, a flicker of surprise in his eyes before his smirk returned, amplified by the whiskey. Evelyn turned her attention to the flight attendant, Brenda, who had heard the entire exchange. Their eyes met. Evelyn expected a word, a gesture, a quiet assurance that this behavior was unacceptable. Instead, she received a tight, non-committal smile and a quick turn of the head. Brenda bustled over to the young men. "Can I get you boys another refill?" she asked, her tone chipper and accommodating. In that moment, Brenda's complicity was a sharper slap than the insult itself. Her refusal to acknowledge the ugliness, her choice to placate the aggressors, made the cabin feel hostile, unsafe. Evelyn felt the walls of her anonymous sanctuary crumble. She tried to retreat back into her work, but the words on the page swam. The air felt charged. 20 minutes later, the turbulence started. It was mild, but the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, advising passengers to remain seated. Chad and Bryce, however, saw it as an opportunity for more disruption. They decided to switch seats, stumbling over each other in the aisle. As Bryce passed Evelyn's seat, the plane gave a slightly more pronounced lurch. It happened in a blur of motion. Bryce, holding a freshly poured full cup of Diet Coke and ice, stumbled. But it wasn't just a stumble. Evelyn saw it in his eyes, a flicker of malicious intent. He didn't try to catch his balance away from her. He leaned into it. The icy brown liquid arced through the air. It wasn't a spill. It was a deluge. The Coke cascaded over her head, drenching her hair, her face and the front of her expensive cashmere top. The cold shock was immediate, followed by the clatter of ice cubes hitting her seat and the floor. A piece of ice slid down the collar of her shirt, cold against her warm skin. For a moment, there was a stunned silence in the cabin. Then Chad erupted in a braying laugh. "Oh, dude, you totally hosed her." Bryce put on a show of mock horror. "Oh my God. I am so sorry," he said, his words slurring together, his eyes gleaming with amusement. "The turbulence. It's just crazy." Evelyn sat frozen, the sticky liquid dripping from her hair onto her journal, smearing the ink. The humiliation was a physical force, pressing down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. It wasn't the Coke. It was the public nature of the degradation. It was the laughter. It was the lie. She slowly, deliberately wiped a sticky trickle from her cheek with the back of her hand. She looked at Bryce, then at the laughing Chad. Then she looked at Brenda, the lead flight attendant, who was now rushing over a handful of cocktail napkins in her hand. "Oh my goodness, what a terrible accident," Brenda said, her voice flustered but devoid of any real empathy. She began dabbing ineffectually at Evelyn's shoulder with the tiny, useless napkins. "These boys, the turbulence can be so tricky." She was already crafting the narrative, an unavoidable accident. "It was not an accident," Evelyn said, her voice low and trembling with a fury she could no longer contain. Brenda stopped dabbing and gave her a placating look, the kind one might give a hysterical child. Now, let's not make a scene. I'm sure he didn't mean it. It's just a little spill. He threw it on me, Evelyn stated, her voice gaining strength. They have been making racist remarks for the past hour, and you did nothing. And now this. This was an assault. A few other passengers were now staring, their expressions ranging from discomfort to mild curiosity. No one said a word. Brenda's professional veneer hardened. Her lips thinned into a firm line. "Ma'am, I will not have you making such accusations. It was an accident. I will bring you some towels and perhaps a change of clothes from the kit. But I need you to remain calm." She turned to Bryce. "You should be more careful," she chided gently, as if he'd merely bumped a table. That was it. The dismissal. The utter invalidation of her reality. Evelyn felt something shift inside her. The doctor, the calm professional, receded, and the wife of Fiona Blackett took her place. She stood up, ignoring the sticky mess that clung to her. She looked directly at Brenda, her eyes blazing. "I am calm," she said, her voice dropping to an icy whisper that cut through the cabin's hum more effectively than a shout. "Your name is Brenda. I want the names of the pilots. I want the full names of these 2 passengers. And I want them noted in an official report. You are a witness to an assault, and you are choosing to ignore it. That is a decision you will regret." Brenda scoffed, a flicker of real anger in her eyes. "You don't get to make threats on my flight, ma'am. Now please sit down, or I will have the captain radio ahead to have you detained upon arrival for causing a disturbance." The threat was so absurd, so completely inverted from the reality of the situation, that Evelyn almost laughed. Detained her. She was the victim of a targeted racist act of humiliation, and she was being threatened with arrest for speaking up about it. She slowly sat back down. She didn't say another word. She simply pulled out her phone. She connected to the plane's Wi-Fi, the signal slow and expensive, but she would have paid $1,000 a megabyte for it in that moment. She opened a secure messaging app and typed a single message to one contact, Fiona. "Jay, I need you to be at the gate at JFK. There's been an incident. I'm okay, but I'm furious. A passenger threw a drink on me. The crew is protecting him. Flight 112, Pan Global Air." The reply came back in less than 10 seconds. It was only 2 words, but they sent a chill down her spine. "I'm coming." Evelyn turned her phone off and stared out the window at the endless blue sky. She didn't look at Brenda or Chad or Bryce again. They no longer existed in her world. They were now part of Fiona's, and Fiona's world had a very different set of rules. The storm was coming, and it was going to be far more powerful than a little turbulence. The descent into JFK was a blur for Evelyn. She spent the remainder of the flight wrapped in a scratchy airline blanket, the sticky residue of the coke a constant humiliating reminder of the incident. She refused any further interaction with the crew, who now gave her a wide berth, their earlier dismissiveness replaced by a nervous uncertainty. Chad and Bryce had finally quieted down occasionally, throwing smug, conspiratorial glances her way. They were confident they had won, that their wealth and privilege formed an impenetrable shield. They had no idea they were flying directly into the eye of a hurricane named Fiona Blackett. As the plane taxied to the gate, Evelyn felt a strange sense of calm descend upon her. It was the calm of inevitability. She had lit a fuse, and now she just had to wait for the explosion. The seatbelt sign pinged off. As the other first-class passengers began to stand and gather their belongings, an announcement came over the PA system, first in the cockpit, then relayed by a suddenly pale-faced Brenda. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you please remain in your seats. No one is to deplane at this time. The jet bridge will not be connected until we receive clearance from ground control. Please remain seated." A murmur of confusion went through the cabin. This was not standard procedure. Chad and Bryce looked annoyed. "What the hell is this?" Bryce muttered. "I've got a car waiting." Evelyn just watched the cabin door. She knew what was happening. Fiona was not a man who waited on tarmacs. He was a man who cleared them. Outside the plane's windows, the familiar ballet of ground crew was absent. Instead, two black Escalades with tinted windows drove directly onto the apron parking near the nose of the aircraft. Several stern-looking men in dark suits emerged, speaking into their wrists. They were followed by uniformed Port Authority police officers. Inside the plane, Brenda's phone buzzed. She answered it, her face draining of all color. Yes, I understand. But sir, yes, sir." She hung up her hand, trembling. The cabin door was opened not by a gate agent, but by two of the Port Authority officers. They stepped inside their presence, immediately sucking all the air out of the confined space. Behind them, stepping up from the jet bridge that had now been silently connected, was Fiona Blackett. He was not a physically imposing man in the traditional sense. He wasn't tall or muscle-bound, but he possessed an intensity that seemed to warp the space around him. Dressed in a flawlessly tailored charcoal suit, his silver-flecked dark hair perfectly styled, he radiated an aura of absolute, unshakable power. His eyes, a piercing shade of blue, scanned the cabin, and when they landed on Evelyn, a flicker of raw, visceral pain crossed his face before being replaced by an icy resolve. He walked straight to her, ignoring everyone else. He knelt by her seat, his hand gently touching her still damp hair. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice a low rumble, meant only for her. "I'm fine," she whispered, the sight of him making her feel safe for the first time in hours. "Just humiliated." His jaw clenched. He kissed her forehead, then stood up, turning to face the cabin. His eyes were like chips of ice. They landed first on Chad and Bryce, who were now staring slack-jawed, a dawning horror on their faces. They were beginning to understand that they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. Fiona's gaze then moved to Brenda, who looked like she was about to faint. "You," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of a death sentence. "You are Brenda, the lead service manager." Brenda swallowed hard, nodding mutely. "My wife, Dr. Evelyn Reed, a passenger on this flight, was verbally harassed and then physically assaulted. You were made aware of the situation. You witnessed it, and you did nothing. In fact, you threatened her." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. "Sir, it was a misunderstanding. An accident." Brenda stammered, her professional composure shattered. Fiona cut her off with a sharp, almost imperceptible gesture. "Do not lie to me. My wife does not lie. And I have the last 2 hours of audio from this cabin's security microphones." A bluff, perhaps, but a devastatingly effective one. The color drained completely from Brenda's face. He then turned to the two young men. "And you, Bryce Montgomery and Corporal Chad Kensington." He knew their names. Of course he knew their names. His team would have identified them, researched their families, their finances, their entire lives before his car had even crossed the Triborough Bridge. Sons of Arthur Kensington and Marcus Montgomery, both of whom have enjoyed profitable relationships with my firm in the past. The boys looked at each other in sheer panic. This man wasn't just rich. He was the sun around which their father's smaller, gilded planets orbited. "You felt it was appropriate to insult my wife, and then you," he pointed a finger at Bryce, "threw your drink on her. An act of cowardice and bigotry. It was an accident." Bryce squeaked, his voice cracking. I swear. Fiona smiled, a chilling, razor-thin expression, devoid of all warmth. The Port Authority police here will be taking your statements. There will be assault charges. My lawyers will be in touch with your fathers to discuss the dissolution of our business arrangements. You see, I have a zero-tolerance policy for this kind of behavior. You have just cost your families a great deal of money. I trust they will explain the finer points of that to you. He then turned his attention to the cockpit door which had opened. The captain and first officer stood there, looking bewildered. Captain, Fiona said, his tone shifting from icy fury to cold business. You are the commander of this vessel. The safety and well-being of the passengers are your responsibility. You failed. Sir, I was unaware of the specifics of the situation in the cabin, the captain began. Precisely, Fiona interrupted. Which is a dereliction of your duty. You are all dismissed. A collective gasp went through the cabin crew. Brenda stared at him aghast. Dismissed? You can't fire us. You don't work for Pan-Global Air. Fiona's smile returned, even more chilling this time. That's where you are mistaken, Brenda. As of 37 minutes ago, when my offer was accepted by their board, I own a controlling interest in this airline. So yes, I can. And I have. All of you. The entire crew of Flight 112. You are fired, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of lives being irrevocably altered. The flight attendants, the pilots, they all stared in stunned disbelief. They had been erased, their careers vaporized in an instant by a man they had never met, all because of a spilled Coke and a failure of basic human decency. Fiona turned back to Evelyn, his expression softening instantly. Let's go home, he said, taking her hand. He led her off the plane, past the dumbstruck crew and the terrified boys being questioned by police. He wrapped his own suit jacket around her shoulders, shielding her from the stares of the other passengers, who were now finally being allowed to deplane into a scene of controlled chaos. As they settled into the plush leather of the Escalade, the city lights streaking past the window, Evelyn leaned her head on his shoulder. The anger and humiliation began to recede, replaced by the warmth of his protective rage. He had defended her. He had brought thunder and lightning down upon those who had wronged her. The story exploded. It was everywhere within hours. Billionaire fires entire flight crew after wife is assaulted. The initial narrative was pure, unadulterated wish fulfillment. Social media erupted in a firestorm of support for Fiona and Evelyn. He was lauded as the ultimate husband, a hero who used his immense power for righteous justice. Hashtags like Blake Justice and Fly Right trended for days. Evelyn received thousands of messages of support, her ordeal becoming a symbol of the everyday racism black women endure, but this time with a fairy tale ending where the dragons were well and truly slain. Fiona Blakett, the reclusive titan, was suddenly a public folk hero. He and Evelyn were the new power couple, symbols of love, loyalty, and the satisfying application of overwhelming force in the face of bigotry. In their penthouse overlooking Central Park, surrounded by the quiet hum of their life, it felt like a victory. It felt like justice. But justice, they were about to learn, has a cost, and when it's delivered with the force of an avalanche, it can create a landslide of unintended, devastating consequences. The world had cheered the spectacle, but the second act was about to begin, and the applause would soon turn to condemnation. For a week, the world was on their side. The story of Fiona Blackety's decisive action was a modern-day fable of right versus wrong. Chad Kensington and Bryce Montgomery became national pariahs. Their social media accounts shuttered under a deluge of hate, their fathers issuing groveling public apologies as the stock prices of their companies took a hit. Blackett Holdings, meanwhile, saw a surge in positive press. Fiona, the ruthless capitalist, was recast as a principled crusader. But narratives, especially in the 21st century media landscape, are fragile things. They are built on emotion and perception, and a single well-placed crack can bring the entire structure down. The crack appeared in the form of a freelance journalist named Amelia Vance. Amelia was in her early 30s, sharp, ambitious, and perpetually hungry for a story that would launch her from the respectable but unremarkable world of online political commentary into the journalistic stratosphere. She, like everyone else, had initially covered the Blackett story as a tale of righteous fury. But her reporter's instincts told her there was more to it. Stories this clean, this morally unambiguous, were rare. She started digging not into the Blacketts or the disgraced college boys, but into the forgotten players, the fired crew of Flight 112. Their names weren't public, but a source at the flight attendants' union, angry about the summary dismissal without due process, gave her a list. She started making calls. Most hung up, too scared or too ashamed to talk. And then she reached Brenda Sullivan. Amelia found Brenda not in a chic Manhattan apartment, but in a modest two-bedroom house in a working-class neighborhood in Queens. When Brenda opened the door, she was not the crisp, authoritative service manager from the flight. She was a woman in her late 50s, her face etched with exhaustion and fear, her perfectly coiffed hair now limp and unstyled. Amelia had expected a defensive, perhaps even bitter woman. Instead, she found someone broken. They sat at a small kitchen table, a stack of unpaid bills held down by a salt shaker. Brenda spoke, her voice raspy, as she told her side of the story. "Was I wrong?" "Yes," Brenda admitted, tears welling in her eyes. "I see that now. I was tired. It was the end of a long trip. Those boys were obnoxious, but we get people like that all the time. You learn to just manage it. Smile, pour the drinks, and get through the flight." She described the moment of the spill. "I saw him stumble. Did I think he maybe leaned into it? Maybe. But in that split second, my brain defaulted to de-escalation. My job is to prevent a scene, not encourage one. The moment Dr. Reed, the moment that lady accused him, my training kicked in. Separate, calm down, file a report later. I misjudged. I misjudged it horribly." Then came the part of the story no one knew. "My husband died 2 years ago. My son, he's 12. He has cystic fibrosis. The medical bills, they're staggering. My job with Pan Global, that was everything. The health insurance was the best in the industry. It's the only reason we've been able to afford his treatments. I worked there for 28 years. 28 years of perfect service records, commendations, training new staff." She pushed a framed photo across the table. It showed a smiling, pale boy with a breathing tube. "Fiona Blackety didn't just fire me. He took my son's health insurance. I have no severance. My pension is in jeopardy. I've been blacklisted. No other major airline will even look at my application. For one mistake, one terrible mistake on one flight. He destroyed my life, and he's risking my son's." Amelia felt a cold knot form in her stomach. This wasn't the story of a villain getting her comeuppance. This was a tragedy. She spent the next few days interviewing the rest of the crew. The co-pilot was a former Air Force veteran flying commercial to put his kids through college. One of the flight attendants was a young woman working 2 jobs to care for her elderly mother. They were not monsters. They were ordinary people who had been caught in the blast radius of a billionaire's rage. They were scared, and they had made a bad call, but the punishment was disproportionate to the crime. Amelia Vance wrote her article. She titled it, "The Collateral Damage of Blackout Justice, the Fired Crew of Flight 112 Tell Their Story." The piece was a masterclass in narrative flipping. She opened with the story of Evelyn's humiliation, acknowledging its ugliness and the racism at its core. She did not absolve Brenda or the crew of their failure. But then she pivoted. She painted a vivid, heartbreaking picture of the lives Fiona Blackett had shattered with a single command. She juxtaposed the image of the Blacketts in their palatial penthouse with Brenda Sullivan in her modest Queen's home, terrified of her son's next hospital visit. The central question of her article was powerful and unsettling. Where does justice end and a tyrannical abuse of power begin? The article, published on a major online news platform known for long-form investigative journalism, did not just go viral. It detonated. The public conversation shifted with dizzying speed. The same social media platforms that had been cheering for Fiona Blackett were now flooded with links to Amelia's article. The hashtags changed. Hashtag Blackett Justice was replaced by hashtag Blackett Cruelty. People started asking questions. Did he have to fire everyone? The pilots who weren't even in the cabin, the junior flight attendant who was in the galley. Why not just report them to the airline's HR? Why the need for such a spectacular, brutal display of force? The story of Evelyn's assault, the very catalyst for the entire event, began to get lost. It was now a footnote in a larger, more complex story about class power and the unaccountability of the ultra-rich. Fiona Blackett, the hero husband, was recast as a ruthless oligarch, a man who would ruin the lives of working-class people over a personal slight. Evelyn watched it happen with a growing sense of horror. The validation she had felt was curdling into something sour and ugly. She read Amelia Vance's article, and the story of Brenda's sick son hit her like a physical blow. As a doctor who dedicated her life to saving children, the idea that her husband's actions could jeopardize a child's health was nauseating. She and Fiona had their first real argument about it one evening in their library, the city lights twinkling below like a distant, uncaring galaxy. "Did you know about her son?" Evelyn asked, her voice quiet but firm. Fiona was standing by the window, a glass of scotch in his hand. "My team's initial report mentioned she had a dependent child with a health condition. It didn't specify." "And that didn't give you pause?" Evelyn pressed. "To fire her, to take away her insurance, knowing that—" Fiona turned his face hard. "Evelyn!" She stood there and watched them humiliate you. She sided with them. She was complicit in a racist act against my wife. What was I supposed to do? Give her a written warning, Sim. There's a world of difference between a warning and total annihilation. "Fiona," she shot back, her voice rising, "you could have demanded she be suspended. You could have insisted on sensitivity training for the entire airline, funded it yourself. You could have ensured those boys faced legal and financial ruin. But you chose the most brutal option possible. You chose to make an example of them, and you didn't care who got hurt in the process." "I cared about you," he thundered, his control finally snapping. "That is the only thing I cared about in that moment. I saw your face, I heard what they did, and I would have burned the world down to make it right for you. I will not apologize for that. Not for her, not for any of them. But this isn't making it right, Evelyn cried, her hands gesturing helplessly. Don't you see what's happening? They've forgotten about what those boys did. They've forgotten about me. My humiliation is now just the excuse for your abuse of power. You've made me a footnote in my own story, Fiona, and you've turned these flawed, scared people into martyrs and us into the villains. The chasm that had opened between them was deep and terrifying. The act of ferocious loyalty that had felt so right, so justified, was now the very thing that was driving a wedge between them. Fiona saw his actions as a pure defense of his love. Evelyn saw it as a reckless display of power that had spiraled out of control, creating new victims and perverting the very nature of the justice she had sought. The unraveling was just beginning. The media storm was one thing, but the consequences were about to hit much closer to home, threatening the very foundations of the empire Fiona Blackett had built. The fallout from Amelia Vance's article was not confined to the court of public opinion. It seeped into the foundations of Fiona Blackett's world, a world built on reputation, trust, and the perception of stability. Wall Street, for all its talk of numbers and data, runs on narrative, and the narrative around Fiona Blackett had turned toxic. The first sign of trouble came from an unexpected quarter. The Blackett Foundation, the philanthropic arm of his empire and Evelyn's personal passion, was scheduled to host its annual fundraising gala for pediatric cancer research. It was the crown jewel of New York's charity season, an event where titans of industry and society competed to write seven-figure checks. A week after the article, the calls began. A major tech CEO, who had pledged a $5 million donation, regretfully pulled out, citing unforeseen scheduling conflicts. A day later, the head of a European banking conglomerate, a longtime friend of Fiona's, withdrew his company's corporate sponsorship. His assistant was apologetic but firm. The current media climate made it untenable. Evelyn watched the guest list and the donation tracker with a sinking heart. The event wasn't just about money. It was her life's work outside of the hospital. It was a beacon of hope for thousands of families. Now it was being tainted by the controversy. Protester groups, galvanized by the story of Brenda Sullivan, announced plans to picket the gala. The headlines were already writing themselves. Protesters denounce Billionaire's gala, while fired workers' son suffers. The backlash was even more direct in Fiona's world. Blackett Holdings was in the final stages of a multi-billion-dollar acquisition of a green energy firm, Viridian Dynamics. It was a legacy-defining deal for Fiona, a move to pivot his firm towards a more sustainable future. The deal required the approval of Viridian's board and its powerful public pension fund investors. One of those investors was the California Public Employees Retirement System, CalPERS, a behemoth known for its focus on corporate ethics and governance. Citing the troubling reports regarding Mr. Blackett's management style and labor practices, CalPERS announced it was launching a review of the acquisition. The statement was couched in polite corporate language, but the message was a cannonball through the hull of the deal. If CalPERS pulled out, others would follow. The Viridian deal was on life support. The irony was venomous. Fiona, the master of the hostile takeover, the man who could spot a weakness in a company's balance sheet from a mile away, had created a fatal weakness in his own reputation. The antagonists in this new drama were no longer two drunk boys on a plane. They were people like Amelia Vance, who followed up her initial story with a deep dive into Blackett Holdings' past acquisitions, painting a picture of a ruthless corporate raider who dismantled companies and laid off workers for profit. They were union leaders who held press conferences on the steps of City Hall, holding up photos of Brenda Sullivan's son. They were rival private equity firms, smelling blood in the water, who began quietly whispering to Fiona's investors and partners, sowing seeds of doubt. Even Chad Kensington and Bryce Montgomery were inadvertently rehabilitated. Their lawyers released a statement saying the boys were deeply remorseful for their immature behavior, but that the resulting corporate retaliation was wildly disproportionate and has ruined the lives of innocent working people. Suddenly, the original villains were repositioned as foolish catalysts for a much greater sin. The pressure was immense. It was a war on multiple fronts, and for the first time in his life, Fiona felt like he was losing. His usual tactics, leveraging power, applying financial pressure, controlling the flow of information, were useless. The story was too emotional, too human. How do you wage war against a picture of a sick child? The strain began to show. Fiona grew more distant, locked in his office for hours. His calls clipped and harsh. The easy intimacy he and Evelyn shared was replaced by a tense silence, the unspoken argument hanging between them at all times. Evelyn felt trapped. She was the central figure, yet she was powerless. Her attempts to reach out to Brenda Sullivan through a third party were rebuffed. Brenda's new pro bono lawyer, a sharp, media-savvy activist, advised her against any attack. Brenda was now a symbol, and symbols couldn't be complicated by private apologies. Evelyn's own world was shaken. At the hospital, colleagues who had once admired her now looked at her with a mixture of pity and judgment. She overheard two nurses whispering in a hallway, "Can you imagine having that much power and using it like that?" They fell silent when they saw her. Her name, once synonymous with healing, was now linked to ruin. The breaking point came during a board meeting for the Blackett Foundation. Evelyn was presenting the revised, scaled-down plans for the gala, when one of the board members, a respected philanthropist named Eleanor Vance, no relation to Amelia, cleared her throat. "Evelyn, we all admire your work." Eleanor began, her tone gentle but firm. "But we have to address the elephant in the room. The controversy surrounding your husband is threatening the very existence of this foundation. Donors are fleeing. Our reputation is in tatters." Another board member chimed in. "We've received a proposal. A major health tech corporation is willing to step in with a massive donation to cover our shortfall, but with a condition. They want Fiona to step down from the board and have his name removed from the foundation's official title." The room fell silent. They were asking her to erase her husband from the legacy she had built, a legacy he had funded and championed from the very beginning. They were asking her to choose between her husband and her life's work. Evelyn looked at the faces around the table. Friends, colleagues, people she had admired for years. She saw their discomfort, their pragmatism. They were trying to save the ship by throwing the captain overboard. She felt a surge of anger so profound it almost made her dizzy. It wasn't just at the board. It was at Fiona for his reckless pride. It was at Brenda for her initial failure. It was at Amelia Vance for her sharp-toothed ambition. It was at the public for their fickle, ravenous appetite for new heroes and new villains. "No," Evelyn said, her voice shaking slightly but clear. "The answer is no." She stood up, gathering her papers. "This foundation is built on my work and my husband's support. It stands for integrity and fighting for those who need it. If you believe the answer is to capitulate to a media narrative and throw the man who built this organization under the bus, then you have forgotten what we stand for. Perhaps you should all resign." She walked out of the boardroom, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. She had drawn her line in the sand. She was standing with her husband. But as she rode the elevator down, the defiant anger gave way to a cold dread. She didn't know if she was standing with him on solid ground or on the edge of a cliff just as the ground began to crumble beneath their feet. The real reckoning was yet to come, not in a boardroom or in the media, but within the walls of their own home. The call came on a Tuesday morning. It was from Robert Sterling, the lead independent director of Blackett Holdings, and one of Fiona's oldest, if most pragmatic allies on the board. He wanted an emergency meeting. The Viridian Dynamics deal was on the verge of complete collapse, and several major institutional investors were threatening to pull their funds from Blackett Holdings itself. The company, once an unassailable fortress, was beginning to look vulnerable. That evening, the penthouse apartment felt less like a home and more like a gilded cage. The silence between Evelyn and Fiona was a living entity thick with resentment, fear, and unspoken accusations. Evelyn had told him about the Foundation's board meeting, about her decision to stand by him. He had simply nodded, his face unreadable, before retreating to his study. She finally found him there, standing before the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the city that now seemed to be turning against him. He hadn't touched the glass of scotch on his desk. "They're going to ask for my resignation," he said without turning around. It wasn't a guess. It was a certainty. He knew how the game was played because he had invented many of the rules. Not as CEO, not yet, but as chairman of the board. They want to put distance between the corporate entity and the toxic personality. Evelyn came and stood beside him, her reflection a faint ghost next to his in the darkened glass. "And what will you do?" "Fight them," he said, his voice a low growl. "Remind them who built this company, who made them all rich." "And what if you lose Fiona?" she asked softly. "What if the narrative is just too strong? What if this is a fight that power and money can't win?" He finally turned to her, and for the first time she saw not the titan of industry, but a man cornered. The icy control in his eyes was gone, replaced by a raw, desperate anger. Then what was it all for Evelyn? The 16-hour days, the gut-wrenching risks, the enemies I made building this. I built it to protect us, to create a world where no one could ever touch you, where you would be safe and respected. The one time I used that power to explicitly defend you, to exact justice for you, that very power becomes the weapon used to destroy me. His voice cracked with a bitterness that shook her. They call me a tyrant. But what about them? The sanctimonious journalist who built her career on the ruins of a flight attendant's life, the board members who celebrated my ruthlessness when it made them money, but now condemn it to save their own skins. The public that cheered me one day and called for my head the next. It's all a game, and I've just become the piece they're willing to sacrifice. I know it's not fair, Evelyn said, her voice laced with a sadness that mirrored his. But Fiona, look at the cost. My foundation is crippled. Your life's work is on the line. And there's a sick child in Queens whose mother sees you as the devil incarnate. You wanted to burn the world down for me, but we have to live in the ashes. She took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she had to say next. It was a truth that had been crystallizing in her mind for days. What you did on that plane, it wasn't just for me. It was for you too. It was about your power. It was about showing them, the boys, the crew, the world, that Fiona Blackett's wife was untouchable. My humiliation gave you the justification to unleash a power you've always held in reserve. He stared at her, his expression a mixture of shock and betrayal. How can you say that? Because I know you, she said, her voice gentle but unwavering. The Fiona I loved, the man who makes me tea, would have ruined those boys' lives quietly and efficiently. He would have used a scalpel. That day you used a sledgehammer, because a part of you needed to. The world saw what they did to me, and you needed the world to see what you would do about it. The problem is the world kept watching. The raw truth of her words hung between them. He wanted to deny it, to rage against it, but he couldn't. She had seen past the protective husband to the proud man beneath the man whose own ego had become intertwined with the act of vengeance. He finally slumped into his chair, the fight draining out of him. "So what do we do?" he whispered. "What's the way out?" "I don't think we fight," she said, kneeling before him, taking his hands in hers. "I think we surrender. Not to them, but to the truth. The first step wasn't the coke. The first step was two entitled boys who believed their privilege made them invisible. And the second step was a crew that was too tired or too intimidated to do the right thing. Everything after that was our mess." The next day, Fiona Blackett walked into the emergency board meeting. But instead of fighting, he began with an apology. Not for defending his wife, but for the method. He announced he was voluntarily stepping down as chairman. Then he went further. He announced the creation of a $10 million fund managed by an independent third party to provide financial and counseling support for the fired crew of Flight 112, ensuring their salaries and benefits would be covered for the next 5 years. He also announced a separate anonymous multi-million-dollar donation to a national fund for families struggling with cystic fibrosis. It was a payment made directly to the lawyer of Brenda Sullivan. Then Fiona and Evelyn did something even more unexpected. They agreed to a single live television interview, not with a fawning host, but with a respected hard-nosed journalist known for her tough questions. In that interview, they didn't make excuses. Evelyn spoke eloquently about the reality of casual racism and the deep wound of public humiliation. Fiona, looking humbled, spoke about his reaction. "My first instinct was to protect my wife," he said, looking directly into the camera. "My second instinct was rage. I acted out of that rage, and while my motivation was love, my actions were flawed. I wielded my power like a club when I should have sought a more precise justice. I created more victims instead of just holding the guilty accountable. Power, I've learned, is a far more dangerous and complicated tool than I ever treated it. I failed to see the humanity of the people I hurt, and for that I am truly sorry." The aftermath wasn't a magical reset. The Viridian deal never recovered. Fiona's reputation was forever changed, no longer the untouchable titan, but a more complex, more human, and more fallible figure. They lost friends. Their world shrank. But in the quiet that followed the storm, they found something they had lost each other. Their relationship, tested by fire and public condemnation, was forged into something stronger, stripped of ego and pride. The hard karma had hit them. It had cost them millions a reputation and a piece of their world. But it had taught them a lesson that few people with their level of power ever learn. Justice is not about the spectacular display of force. It is not about vengeance or making an example of someone. True justice, they now understood, is quiet. It is precise, and it must always be tempered with grace. They had survived, but they would forever carry the scars of the day a spilled Coke set their world on fire. And there you have it, a story that started with a single act of hatred and spiraled into a global debate about power, justice, and the unforeseen consequences of our actions. The story of Fiona and Evelyn Bleckett isn't just a drama. It's a mirror reflecting our own complicated world. It forces us to ask, what would we do with that kind of power? When does a hero's righteous anger turn into a villain's cruelty? These are the kinds of stories we are passionate about, sharing stories that make you think, that challenge your perspective, and that stay with you long after the video ends. If you were captivated by this real-life drama, if you felt the anger, the triumph, and the heartbreak, please show your support. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a powerful story, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the dramas that shape our world. Thank you for listening.